SAP Enable Now allows you to generate printable documents from simulations. There are actually 11 types of available documents depending on what information you want to see and the format of that documentation. And then there are another two formats, the compound document and the master document, which effectively just allow you to consolidate multiple other documents into a single document. Now, each of these documents, as I say, has particular information that's shown in it and a particular format. But what I see quite often is clients wanting to add additional information into their documents that isn't in the simulation. And typically the way they do that is by generating one of these standard document types and then adding additional information to that once it's been generated. Now, I really don't like doing that. I don't like to perform any form of editing on the document once it has been generated from the simulation. Strictly because if you change anything in the simulation, you then need to regenerate the document and you've lost all of the information in it that was not in the simulation and that you edited into it later. So in this video, I want to look at ways of providing additional information within the simulation project so that that information appears on the printed document, even if it's not strictly a part of the simulation playback. So I've taken a copy of the standard document and I've customized that to provide information in it that I want to see in my printed document. And that's this one here, GloboCorp user procedure, and we'll look at what information I provide in that and where that information comes from. So here is a generated version of that simulation. This SU3 maintaining your SAP user profile, which was the simulation I was just looking at. And in here, there's a lot of different bits of information. Now, the simulation itself actually starts from here. This first part is an explanation bubble at the start of the simulation, and then the 1.2 specify the transaction heading is the first step within the simulation, and it goes all the way through there. Everything above that is additional information that I've provided. Some of that is fairly standard stuff that you can bring in yourself, and then there's a few specialized things that I've also put into there. So if I work my way backwards through here, first of all, we have a table of contents, which is automatically generated. I'll show you how we get that included. I've then got this yellow box in here. This is actually a text unit which is pulling in some information that I want to appear in every single document that I generate of this particular format. So this exact same text in this exact same format is brought into here every single document. Above that, I have a revision history which shows me all of the changes that have been made to this document. Above that, I have another set of information which is actually the description that's being pulled from the simulation project itself. There is obviously repetition in here. I've got the version history and I've got my revision history here showing exactly the same thing. In reality, you wouldn't have those. This is just to show you different ways that this information can be pulled in. And then above that, I have this little table here showing me the scope, content owner, and last review date. And then above that, I also have the same information in a different format. So I'm going to show you where all of these come from. Oh, one last thing, way down at the bottom, I also have a glossary in here, which is automatically pulling in all of the glossary entries that are referenced within this simulation, and it puts them all into a table. So let's look at where some of this information is coming from. Here's the document definition for my GloboCorp user procedure. You can find all of the document definitions in terms of what information blocks are included in each document type under Resources, Documentation Settings. This one here, GloboCorp user procedure, that's the one I've generated here. And this explains exactly what information is in there. I've already done an extensive blog post on how to define this stuff and exactly what these things do. So I'm just going to look very briefly at what types of information we have in our document and where they're being pulled from. So most of this is being pulled in via fragments. Okay, there are 12 possible fragments that you can include in your document, and each fragment is basically a building block of information. And I'll show you where these things are being pulled from. This fragment one, this text unit, which is actually this text unit here of document properties, that is this blue box up at the top, at the very, very top here. The next fragment I've got being pulled in is the description. This is being pulled in from the description of the simulation project. And if I go and select that simulation project, it's this exact information here, starting with, although SAP is a global system, and then the version history log. You can see that's exactly this information I've got over here as well. So that's where that's being pulled in from. Next, I've got a revision history fragment. This is this specific table here. Okay, where this information comes from is actually in the simulation project. You have to enter these revision entry macros, one per version. This version 1, version 5 is just a label I've put in. The key information here is revision date, change, changed by, and revision ID. And they are the 4 columns that you see in this table here. Every revision entry macro that I have in here, you can see will result in a row in this table here. So if you're disciplined about this and you want to provide a nice, concise change log in here, this is a good way of doing it. The change ID is really just a change control identifier. You can use it for anything you like. All of these are really just text fields. But that's where that information is being pulled from. Next up in our document definition, I have another text unit being pulled in, which is my training data caveat. That is this yellow box of information here. Then you can see that I have the table of contents, and then I have the project content, which is actually the entire simulation content that are brought in there. And then finally at the end, I have the glossary. These are the fragments, the blocks of information that I'm using in my particular document here. There are others. If you go and look at any of these, you can see there are other things I can bring in here. I can bring in book pages. I can bring in a table of the input values. I can insert various blank lines and breaks and stuff like that. I can include the short description of the process flow as well. So there are other things that you can bring in. Again, the blog post explains all of these in exhaustive detail. Now, so far so good. This is all information that you can bring in that may not necessarily be shown during simulation playback. Like this changelog here, if you choose to use the revision history, all of this information here, these 5 macros here, are not shown during simulation playback. Effectively, they only exist in the document. Now, the next thing that I want to look at, and probably the most important thing in all of this, is the additional information that isn't anywhere else and doesn't really have a specific home within the simulation. And that's these fields here: the scope, content owner, and last review date. These do not exist as properties in SAP Enable Now in a simulation project. They're basically properties I have defined and said, I want this information to be included in my document. So let's look at where that comes from. And again, just to clarify, you would not have both of these tables in here, the control information one and then the one under overview. I've put them both in here so that you can see the differences between them and where they pull the information from. And this is very, very critical. So let's look first at where the scope is coming from. And all of these, the scope, content owner, and last review date, I could pull in the same way. I'm using 2 different ways here to show you the differences between them. First of all, this scope. This is being pulled in from a document properties macro. Now you may be familiar with this because this is automatically added as part of the BPP standard document, but really it is just another documentation macro called document properties, and it gives you a set of 6 name value pairs. Here you need to give it a unique identifier. Here I'm calling it GCP_scope. I'm calling all of my custom properties GCP for Globocorp, just so that they're differentiated from any SAP Enable Now built-in properties. And I'm giving that a value of Americas. And you can see that's exactly what's being pulled in here, the scope of Americas. In this table, it's not there, and we'll look at why in a minute. In this example, I've only provided 1 document property. I can add up to 6 in here. If I need to provide more than 6 unique properties, I can just insert another document properties macro. This text here of complete these values, I've added that myself just to make sure the authors know that this is stuff that they need to do. But again, you'll typically have that in your style guide or your editing checklist to say make sure that you've specified the document properties. Now let's look at where these other 2 are coming from, the content owner and the last review date. Now these are actually being pulled in by completely custom properties that I have defined for my simulation projects. if I go and look at this simulation project, I've got various categories of properties here. Basic properties, start links, protocol, and then down at the bottom, I've got Globocorp custom properties. These are properties that I have defined myself. If you want to know how to get them, speak to your SAP Enable Now implementation consultant and they can get these set up for you. It does get technical, but I want to let you know that it is something that is possible to do. I actually have 3 properties defined here. They only exist for simulation projects. If I select some other type of object like a book page, you can see that I don't have those custom properties in there. They only exist for simulation projects because that's how I've defined them. Now, I actually have 3 of those defined: content owner, last review date, and then this additional information one. And you can see here that I'm only using content owner and last review date in here. So I can have as many of these defined as I like and use whichever ones I want to. Behind the scenes, each of these has to have its own unique identifier, its technical name. They are these. And then what I need to do for these ones here, and for my document properties one in here, I need to provide a way of getting those into the document. And that's where we start to get the difference between these. I'm going to start with this top one here, this control information box. This has actually been entered into the Word document template. So if I go and look at that, and it is this document template here. If I open that document template, you can see that what I have in it is nothing but a placeholder that's going to put the title on there. And then I've got this table, which is exactly what you see in the document when it's been generated. And this effectively has the same 3 things in it. But if I show you the field codes for that, you can see that I have the GCP scope, which we saw was coming out of our simulation, and then my other 2, the GCP owner and GCP review, which are being pulled from my custom properties. So all this is doing is taking those values from the simulation and dropping them into here for me. Now, the tricky part is that each of those, GCP scope, GCP owner, GCP review, they need to be defined as custom properties in my document. And if I go to my document information under properties, advanced properties, and go to custom, I can see that this is where they are defined. They are custom properties in my Word template. And they must have exactly the same name here as is used in SAP Enable Now. But as long as they have the same name, when SAP Enable Now generates this document, it will pull that information into those specific custom properties within your Word document. So that's how they are getting in there. And all 3 of those things are defined. There are values in them all, and that's where it's all coming from. So let me go back to here again and look at my simulation. And you can see again that I've got a content owner of me, last review date 2021-04-18, which has been pulled in as well, and then I've got the scope. Now that's where this block of information is being pulled from. It's being put in the actual Word document template itself. Where is this one being pulled from? If you recall, when we looked at our document definition, I have something in here under fragment 1, i.e. the very first thing, I have a text unit of document properties. And if I go and look at that text unit, which I have here, that has in it this table that you can see. You can see that it's using placeholders for the exact same properties in here: GCP scope, GCP owner, GCP review. Okay, so all this is doing is getting that same information and putting it in a table with a heading of overview, just to keep it nice and neat. And that's what's being dropped into my document when I generate it, because it's defined as a fragment in my document definition. So far, so good. Now, the last thing that I want to emphasize here is why I see the scope populated here and not here. There is a scope value. If I go and look at my simulation, the scope's right there and it's Americas. So why is it not appearing here? The reason is that when SAP Enable Now generates this document, it pulls all of the information it needs and then it drops it into the Word document. So it's all down to when SAP Enable Now gathers these blocks of information. This block of information right here is being pulled in as a fragment. And that fragment exists outside of the actual simulation. Okay? The fact that it's pulling information about that simulation is really neither here nor there, but it's not part of the project content. Okay? So at the time it builds the overall content of the simulation and pulls in this text unit, it has not opened the project at that point. It has not opened the simulation, so it does not have access to any properties that are defined within that simulation. And within that simulation is where we've got our scope property. So because it hasn't actually opened the project at that time, because it doesn't do that until Fragment 6, it doesn't know about that information. Therefore, it can't fill that in. It does know about these other two because they're part of the metadata for this particular object, and they're not within the simulation project, but they belong to the simulation project, so it can find that information. By contrast, when it generates this first block of information here is when it's gathered all of the information and then it is putting that into the document. And at that point, it has all of this information. So that's why it can include that information there. So that's why I can see the scope here when it's being pulled into my Word document template, but I do not see the scope here because it's being pulled in as a text unit outside of the simulation project content itself. Subtle difference, but an important one, because this means that you need to decide where you're going to provide this information on your printed document and then how you can get that information at the right time so that it displays here. Now, this information here that's being pulled into the Word document template, the only place I can provide that is right up at the front of the document. If you remember when we looked at the Word document template, the DOT file, that was the very first thing in it. Because when SAP Enable Now builds out the rest of the content, it's going to start from the bottom of the existing document. And this information is in front of it. All of the other information is being dropped into that document in the order that I show here. Now, I can reorder any of these that I want by putting the fragments in a different order. So I could have, for example, I can have my revision history ahead of all of this other information, or I can have it at the very end of the document if I want to put it there, because I can adjust these blocks of information here by changing which order the fragments appear here. However, what I cannot do is insert information into the middle of the project content. The project content is basically the simulation recording, and it's going to put all of that information in effectively in one chunk because it's in one fragment. So I cannot, for example, start putting information in here that's coming from the project content, then put in some of this information here, maybe a text unit or something else like that, and then carry on with the simulation project. It's all got to be one unit of information. Okay, so that is the last thing that I wanted to show to you. And the key takeaway from this is if you want to provide information into your generated document, that information should be in the simulation to start with. And you can include that information either in explanation macros like we have here, or you can include it in the description field here or the short description and pull that information in, or like we see here, you can include it in text units, and you can use multiple text units in different places, or you can provide them as custom document properties in here. One limitation with that, the value can only be 255 characters long. Or you can provide your own custom properties this way. These are better because you can provide much more information in here, and you can provide full text fields and multiple paragraphs if you really want to. But it is configuration and customization work, so you'll probably need to get some help from an implementation consultant to get that done. But Once you've done that and you've got all of the information in here, you can provide as much information as you need to be in your finished document within your simulation, so that every time you generate the document, all of the information is already in there and you do not need to do any post-editing on that document once it has been generated, which is the key point in all of this. By providing this information in the simulation itself, you're going to save yourself any editing work and any re-editing work whenever you update that simulation project. That was it. Hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching.